What if I told you that fixing your squat technique could literally double your leg growth? It sounds like clickbait, but a recent study actually found exactly that. Today, I'll break down the science of how to squat for maximum hypertrophy, and what most lifters get wrong while squatting. First, let's start with the actual squat science. A study by Kubo and colleagues compared squatting to 90 degrees of knee flexion to squatting to 140 degrees of knee flexion. That's basically ass to grass. They measured hypertrophy of the hamstrings, quads, glutes, and even adductors using MRI, and they had some really interesting findings. First, the hamstrings didn't grow at all, and this is a huge misconception about the squat. While many lifters assume that the hamstrings do get trained during the squat, several studies, including this one and a study by Plotkin and colleagues, show that squats don't grow the hamstrings. The authors also found that while the quads grew similarly with 90 versus 140 degrees of knee flexion, the glutes and adductors grew around twice as much when squatting ass to grass, suggesting that for your best overall leg growth, you should squat pretty deep. Likewise, another study by Blomqvist and colleagues compared squatting to 60 degrees of knee flexion to squatting to 120 degrees of knee flexion. In this study, the researchers yet again found that squatting deeper led to greater quadricep hypertrophy. So two things are clear. One, you want to squat reasonably deep, at least 90 degrees or so for quad development. But two, when it comes to overall leg development, including the glutes and adductors, you probably want to squat as deep as you can. Now let's talk about squat biomechanics. The hardest part of a squat is in the mid-range, right above parallel. If you're squatting properly, this is likely where you'll fail. Both the hip extensors, the gluteus maximus and the adductor magnus, and the knee extensors, the quads, are heavily involved. Although the limiting factor, the muscle that gives out first, will depend on your strengths, weaknesses, and your technique. There are a few things we don't quite know yet about squat technique for hypertrophy. First, is going beyond 90 degrees needed for your best quad growth? Likewise, the impact of doing a high bar squat versus a low bar squat versus a front squat remains somewhat unclear. Indeed, to date, we have no studies comparing low bar versus high bar for hypertrophy. With that being said, most lifters will miss some knee flexion range of motion and quad stretch with a low bar placement, because your hips are pre-flexed at the start of the movement, meaning you'll run out of hip flexion range of motion before you hit full knee flexion. For overall leg development, therefore, a high bar placement is likely the best. However, a low bar placement can be good if you really want to maximize glute and adductor stimulus. Since you pre-flex the hips, you make sure you get a full stretch on the glutes and adductors at the bottom. And for what it's worth, although not many people talk about them, front squats are probably also just as good, just less comfortable. In fact, one study by Ennis and colleagues compared the front squat to the high bar squat and found similar quadricep hypertrophy. So if you're okay with the pain of having a bar in your collarbone, front squatting is a good idea. Next, let's talk about bracing. Generally, when squatting, you want to hold your breath during the concentric phase, as this has been shown to increase intra-abdominal pressure and improve performance. Specifically, you probably want to perform the Valsalva maneuver. The Valsalva maneuver is a forceful exhalation against a closed airway, achieved by closing the mouth and holding your breath, then straining as if having a bowel movement. An easy cue is to think of someone punching you in the stomach and you getting ready to resist that punch. Next, let's talk about knee position. There are two muscles people are really overlooking when it comes to the squat. That's the adductor magnus and the gluteus maximus. The adductor magnus is a huge muscle on the side of your leg that actually makes the front of your leg look a lot bigger if you train it properly. Likewise, if you squat deep, your glutes are also getting a great stimulus during the squat, but only if you use the correct technique. What about stance width? Should you go wide or should you go narrow? We don't really have any research on this just yet. Biomechanically, wider stances may emphasize the adductors slightly more due to them being in a stronger position. And because a wider stance allows you to stay more upright, this may reduce lower back involvement. However, this is only biomechanical speculation. There is no hypertrophy research on this just yet. So for the time being, I would heavily recommend using what feels good in terms of comfort for your joints and allows for the most range of motion at both the hip and the knee. When it comes to your toe angle, whether you point your feet straight ahead or a bit out, it's a similar story. There's no real research. It is very unlikely to make a meaningful difference in terms of the hypertrophy. It just doesn't move the needle of muscle length for the glutes, for example, by that much. So, yet again, just adopt whatever's most comfortable. Before we get into common mistakes on the squat that you should really avoid for hypertrophy, here's a word from today's sponsor. If you want your entire training built around this kind of science, exercise selection, volume, technique, all optimized for hypertrophy, check out MyoAdapt. It's my app that takes everything I talk about here on this channel and turns it into a personalized program that actually adapts to your progress. You can start a free 2-week trial today using code WOLF. Go to MyoAdapt.com. And if you want more hands-on help, from refining your technique to managing fatigue, recovery, and nutrition, that's exactly what I do with my coaching clients. You can see if we're a good fit by booking a free call in the description. Also, huge thanks to Rascal Apparel for supporting the channel, my favorite gym clothing. You can use code WOLF at checkout for 10% off. Let's get into some common mistakes that you should avoid. First, bar placement. Many lifters place the bar way too high, especially if they're new to squatting. Ultimately, bar placement is mostly a matter of personal preference and comfort. As I mentioned, a low bar placement may help a bit with glutes and adductors, whereas a high bar placement is generally best for hypertrophy. You should find a bar placement that's most comfortable, but here's some advice. First, don't place the bar on your neck. This is the most likely culprit for why you're having neck pain from squatting. There's oftentimes some bony bits protruding out of your neck, and if you place your bar directly on that, you're gonna have a bad time. This is often what leads beginners to needing to use a pad for the squat. For a high bar placement, try to put it on your upper traps for overall leg development. Find the meatiest, thickest part of the upper traps and place your bar directly across it. For a low bar squat, place it on the meatiest, thickest part of your rear delts. The second big mistake is cutting your range of motion short. You may not even notice you're doing this, so definitely take a video of your squat to assess. To fix this, you'll almost certainly need to use less weight, as you can squat way less if you go deep versus just half squatting. Once you've dropped the weight, here's the fix. Try breaking at the knees and the hips simultaneously. People often advocate for sitting back in the squat, or trying to stay as upright as possible, breaking only at the knees. But the reality is that both of these cues usually limit depth. Break at both the knees and the hips simultaneously, and you should find you can go way deeper. Finally, when it comes to depth, practice is king. If you're a beginner, your depth just won't be that amazing, and that's okay. Just keep practicing the movement and you will get better and better at it with time. You'll get more flexible too. Some research has shown that lifting is nearly as good as stretching when it comes to improving your flexibility over time. So just keep it squatting and you will get better. The next big mistake is turning your squat into a good morning. To be clear, this isn't strictly speaking a mistake if it's intentional. After all, pushing your hips back a ton does lead to a ton of glute and adductor stimulus. However, for most people, they want both quad, glute, and adductor growth from their squat, and correcting the good morning squat shifts the load back over the quads a little bit. So if you're not intentionally doing a good morning, try the cue hips forward, shoulders back into the bar. This should fix your good morning position back into a proper squat position. Alternatively, I also sometimes try the cue knees forward. You should use this cue as soon as you start ascending on the squat, as the good morning position typically starts around the parallel position. Next, and this is a huge one, and one of the most detrimental mistakes you can make, is simply not going close to failure enough. And look, I get it. Lower body movements are difficult, and especially for somewhat scary movements like the squat, where you could get pinned if you push too close to failure without spotter arms or a spotter nearby. Training close to failure is paramount for hypertrophy. A meta-analysis by Robinson and colleagues clearly showed the closer a set is taken to failure, the more hypertrophy that set causes. So if you're not getting close to failure on your squats, you are leaving growth on the table. Here are a few tips to make it easier to push close to failure. My first tip, get close to failure. Going to failure on the squat is only safe if you're used to bailing, aka dropping the weight behind you, have spotter arms, or if you have a spotter nearby that can help you. Second, to know how close to failure you are, pay attention to rep speed. How quickly are you able to lift the weight in your best attempt? You should always be trying to lift the weight as quickly as possible. When you're doing this, the last couple of reps should take a minimum of 2 seconds to complete. The longer the rep takes, the closer you are to failure. If you want to get to failure, or very close to failure, I heavily recommend setting up safeties. Some people claim that hitting failure on squats is a bad idea for injury risk. I'm personally not aware of any research that shows this. Just emphasize good technique and use technical failure rather than all-out muscular failure. This next mistake is a bit speculative, but I personally think it is a mistake. Many lifters don't control the stretch position at all. They don't control the eccentric much near the stretch position, and they don't pause at the bottom of the squat. Now, just to caveat what I'm about to say, tempo generally doesn't matter much based on the research. We conducted a meta-analysis on tempo and didn't really find a benefit of slower eccentrics for hypertrophy. However, based on the research on the stretch, I think it makes sense to generally emphasize the stretch. There's 3 things I do to emphasize the stretch during the squat. 1, I control the eccentric more as I reach into the stretch. 2, I pause briefly in a fully stretched position. And 3, I explode out of that stretched position. When pausing at the bottom, ensure you're in control of the weight and not just letting your hamstrings completely rest against your calves. Additionally, being explosive out of that bottom position makes your speed on the rep a better predictor of how close to failure you are. Nearly unequivocally, when I see someone failing to get close to failure on squats, it's because they're not squatting as explosively as possible on the way up, and therefore they never never really have a good gauge of how close to failure they really are. Next mistake is religiously sticking to a wide stance for glutes and a narrow stance for quads. The truth is, we simply don't have research to strongly support either one being true. And so instead, I recommend using the stance width and the toe angle that suits your body, not the one you think might be best based on some biomechanics. Now that we've covered some really common mistakes to avoid, here's a step-by-step guide on how to squat. Start by setting the bar at a height that allows you to unrack with a quarter or an eighth of a rep. Always squat facing the rack, or a mirror, so you can see where the bar is when you're re-racking. Not being able to see the bar when you're re-racking is a huge mistake, as it can quickly increase the injury risk. I can't tell you how many times I've seen lifters squat backwards, miss the rack, and have a bit of an accident. Let's start with the variables of your setup that are more flexible or individual. First, your toe position and your stance width. To figure this out, grab the bar and place it on your back. Try a variety of positions, see what is most comfortable, and lets you get deepest. Put the bar on the thickest part of your upper traps or the thickest part of your rear delts for a high bar or low bar placement respectively. Once you've walked the bar out, try a variety of stance widths and toe positions to see what's most comfortable and lets you get deepest. For most people, that will be somewhere around hip width or slightly wider, with toes pointed out about 10 to 15 degrees. If you're unsure about where to start here. This is speculative, but this stance width may also be best for glutes, quads, and lower back, which is more important to your overall physique development than developing your adductors. To start a squat set, stand a few steps behind the bar. Set your hands on the bar. For your hand position, as a default, bring your hands in as close as you can comfortably once you've set the bar on your back. There is a time and a place for a wider grip if you have poor mobility, but ultimately go as narrow as you can given your mobility and comfort. Once your hands are set, get under the bar. Your midfoot should now be directly underneath the bar when you unrack. Now it's time to brace. Pretend someone is about to punch you and you're bracing against the impact. Do this before unracking and before you descend on every rep. Next, unrack the weight using a quarter or an eighth of a rep. If you need to do more than about a quarter rep, you've set the pins way too low. Next, you can do a 2 or a 3-step walkout. A 3-step walkout is more forgiving and a better approach for beginners. You take one small step, then a big step with the other leg, and then a final small step to get into position. This should be your default approach. A 2-step walkout is more efficient, since you're doing fewer steps. It wastes less energy where you have to brace against the load, but it is more skilled, so I'd only recommend it if you're well practiced. Once you've walked the weight out, take a moment to brace again. Descend under control. There's no strict guideline on how long this should take, but have some control. On the way down, if you struggle with depth, here's a cue. Break at the hips and knees simultaneously. If you're still struggling with depth, you can use weightlifting shoes or plates underneath your heels. Alternatively, a good warm-up for squats can be calf raises. This will increase your ankle range of motion. The aim on the way down is to get maximum knee flexion and hip flexion for a high bar placement or maximum hip flexion range of motion for a low bar placement. If this doesn't work for you at all, it's a matter of experimenting with stance and toe angle and continuing to practice. Once you reach the bottom of the rep, slow down the eccentric more. Pause briefly in the full stretch. Try to remain in control versus simply letting your hamstrings rest against your calves. Explode out of the bottom position. If your mechanics on the squat are on point, I prefer the cue explode. However, if on the way back up, you struggle with a good morning pattern, the cue hips forward or shoulders back or knees forward can help. If your knees tend to cave in, the cue rip the floor in half by pushing your knees out can help. Finally, let's talk about re-racking. Don't just lean forward to re-rack the weight. This is a super weak and unstable position. It increases risk a ton compared to just walking it back in. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in that next one.